On October 27, 1984, during an expansion of Tokyo's old Haneda Airport, workers stumbled upon a relic, a massive twin-row radial air-cooled engine with 22 cylinders in total. It turned out to be one of the top-secret Ha-5010 engines from World War II, a monster engine that had practically become a myth. Its discovery inevitably brought back whispers of another wartime legend, a colossal plane codenamed Fugaku. The name Fugaku was inspired by Japan's sacred Mount Fuji, a symbol known worldwide and immortalized in Katsushika Hokusai's 36 Views of Mount Fuji. When you name an aircraft after something as iconic as Fuji, you're obviously making a statement. This wasn't just any bomber. It was the mythical big bird that was going to crush your enemies and make you the pride of your nation. So, what was this Fugaku supposed to be exactly? It was early 1942. Japan was on a euphoric high, celebrating its early wins in the Pacific War, with everyone clinking glasses and basking in their temporary triumph. Well, not everyone. One man seemed to have run out of celebratory sake, Chikuhei Nakajima, founder of Nakajima Aircraft Company. While the nation was busy patting itself on the back, Nakajima was busy brooding over America's overwhelming industrial capacity, especially as the Americans were hard at work building colossal bombers like the B-29. Nakajima, ever the buzzkill, foresaw that by 1944 these bombers would turn Japan into a nice piece of Swiss cheese. So, what was his solution to prevent this? Well, obviously, to build an even bigger bomber capable of flying all the way to America, bomb their factories, and fly back home in time for dinner. Simple, right? But Nakajima's genius plan wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms. You see, the Japanese military was all in on fighter planes, believing more fighter planes equals more winning. They weren't exactly thrilled with Nakajima's little scheme to bomb the United States, which they probably saw as trying to out-crazy the Americans. Nakajima, however, wasn't the kind of guy who just backs off when people say no. He had a dream, and by God, he was going to pursue it, even if it meant dragging every one of his engineers through hell. Determined to build this mega bomber himself, Nakajima founded the Invincible Air Defense Club. He put his chief engineer, Yasushi Koyama, in charge and got his team working day and night. Picture a group of exhausted engineers discussing whether it's still possible to build a bomber the size of a small village while sleep-deprived and slowly losing their minds. That was essentially Nakajima's dream team in early 1943. By January 1943, they finally hammered out the basic design. Nakajima dubbed it the Z Bomber, named after the Z flag from the Russo-Japanese War, which apparently stood for, "This might be a terrible idea, but let's do it anyway." The bomber's requirements were, well, let's say ambitious: a combat radius of no less than 8,500 kilometers, 21-ton bombs, defensive guns galore, armored seats for the crew, and it had to fly at 10,000 meters while keeping up with enemy fighters. And to top it off, Nakajima wanted to use as few materials as possible to make mass production a breeze. Easy, right? This grand plan to build a flying fortress that could level entire cities with precision bombing, evade enemy fighters, and fly thousands of kilometers sounded great, if you ignored the fact that Japan didn't exactly have the resources or experience to pull it off. Still, Nakajima's authority within his company was absolute. If Nakajima wanted a plane that could fight Godzilla, his employees would find a way to at least sketch it out. So, in April 1943, Nakajima gathered his top engineers, including Yasushi Koyama, Ota Minoru, Shibuya Gen, Yasuo Naito, and Ryoichi Nakagawa at the Nakajima Club, a welfare facility in Gunma Prefecture. There he laid out his preemptive strike, revive the Empire plan. The engineers were ordered to move into the club, where they would eat, sleep, and breathe Z-bomber designs until June, working non-stop until they had a finalized design. It became known as the Club Confinement Incident, and honestly, the engineers were oddly proud of it afterward. Stockholm Syndrome, perhaps? After 2 months of near imprisonment and non-stop calculations, they managed to create a blueprint. The plane, which was probably bigger than the engineers' wildest nightmares, would be 45 meters long with a 65-meter wingspan. It weighed a modest 67 tons and could fly at 680 kilometers per hour at 7,000 meters altitude. It could carry 20 tons of bombs for a distance of 16,000 kilometers. Sure, the range wasn't ideal, but it was almost enough. Close enough to call it a success, at least. The only problem? Well, the engine just wasn't cooperating. Nakajima's Mitaka Research Institute couldn't get past the mountain of technical issues. The team worked day and night, trying to get an engine that could power this behemoth, but no matter how much coffee they consumed, the engine issue remained. Meanwhile, Nakajima wasn't going to let a little thing like physics stop him. He had connections in government, and he was going to use them. By this point, the war was going about as well as you'd expect for Japan, which is to say, poorly. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and Nakajima managed to convince some military leaders that his plan was worth pursuing. On April 15th, 1943, at an awards ceremony, Military Affairs Bureau Major General Kenryo Sato gave a speech about the role of science and technology in war, and casually mentioned the need to bomb mainland America. You know, just drop it in there between awards for good conduct. According to Sato, bombing America was no big deal. After all, aviation technology had advanced so much that flying across the Pacific was a piece of cake. He even went on to say that the day of jointly bombing the United States with Germany and Italy isn't far off. Spoiler alert, it never happened. Nakajima's Z-bomber plan finally found a few allies in the military. On April 26th, he formally submitted the Z-bomber concept to the Inspectorate General of Aviation, and in August, he even wrote a lengthy paper titled Invincible Strategy. Apparently, if you can't get things done by actually building planes, you just write a manifesto and hope that works. He printed 50 copies of his work and quietly distributed them to influential figures, including Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, Prince Takamatsu, and even former Prime Minister Konoe. The paper not only covered the basic concepts of the plane, but also outlined its intended use, which was basically bomb the US until they give up. It was, in short, an utterly mad plan. In Nakajima's magnum Invincible Strategy, he didn't just settle for one bomber. Oh no, that would be too easy. Instead, he dreamed up a whole series of aircraft, each more audacious and impractical than the last. This grand collection included 5 different models: the Z bomber, which carried 20 tons of bombs; the Z strafing plane, featuring either 96 cannons or 400 machine guns, because apparently the more the merrier; the Z torpedo plane, equipped with 21-ton torpedoes; and the Z transport plane, capable of carrying either 200 paratroopers or 50 tons of cargo. Because why settle for ordinary when you can make the Air Force equivalent of a kitchen sink approach? The Z-bomber was envisioned to level American factories and airfields with military-grade efficiency, or at least that's what Nakajima hoped. Each plane would drop 21-ton bombs, spaced 50 meters apart, creating a 1 kilometer long, 50-meter wide, 15-meter deep crater. Now imagine 20 bombers doing that in formation. Voila. You get 1,000,000 square meters of destruction. Sounds effective. Until you remember Japan didn't have an air force large enough, or pilots crazy enough to fly these monsters into American airspace. But hey, the devil's in the details, right? Next up, the Z strafing plane, Nakajima's twisted answer to the growing enemy bomber threat. The plane would have 96 20mm cannons or 400 7.7mm machine guns, because if you can't make them big, make them overcompensate. The 20mm version could form a 2.5-meter wide, 3-kilometer long barrage of bullets that could supposedly take out an entire formation of 50 bombers. The 7.7mm version, meanwhile, was all about volume. It could create a 10-kilometer long, 2.5-meter wide bullet net that could obliterate anything from bombers to battleships. According to Nakajima, a formation of 15 of these planes could, in a minute, lay down a 45-meter wide, 10-kilometer long bullet net. It was the kind of plan that could make a Michael Bay movie look realistic. The grand scheme was, of course, beautifully bonkers. First, the Z strafing plane would destroy enemy bomber formations and strip enemy ships of any anti-air capabilities. Then, the Z torpedo plane would swoop in to finish off the helpless ships. But it didn't end there. Nakajima envisioned that, to attack mainland America, Japan could set up forward bases in German-occupied France. After bombing the United States and destroying industrial targets, they could land in Europe, resupply, and go back for more, like some kind of round-trip apocalypse. And for the grand finale, Nakajima envisioned an invasion of America without using a single ship. The plan involved an army of 4,000 Z-bombers, 2,000 Z strafing planes, and 5,000 Z transport planes, carrying 3 million troops. This enormous fleet would attack Pacific airfields, sending in waves of bombers and strafing planes to destroy 600 of the 700 American bases along the coast. The remaining 100 bases? Easy. Drop paratroopers, establish control, and repeat until Japan had a nice, cozy foothold on the west coast. From there, America would just be a hop, skip, and a blitzkrieg away from surrendering. Now, it's easy to laugh, but let's not forget that even attempting such a plan was a tall order, one requiring production numbers on a sky's the limit scale. Japan didn't exactly have the spare change for such endeavors, nor the factories, nor the manpower. Nakajima may have included a section on production planning in his Invincible Strategy. But let's be real, it was more a wish list than a blueprint, all wishful thinking and bold declarations with not an ounce of practicality. Yet Nakajima's Invincible Strategy, combined with his reputation as the king of aircraft, managed to captivate military leaders who, let's face it, probably should have known better. By September, the Army and Navy had taken Nakajima's idea seriously enough to discuss it further. Naturally, the Army wanted a heavily armed version that could reach 10,000 meters, while the Navy wanted a more lightly armed version that could fly at 15,000 meters. And of course, these discussions devolved into a back and forth over the merits of different configurations, as they wrangled over the finer points of the impossible. In the end, after much debate, the compromise settled on a slightly more realistic version, a 15,000-meter ceiling, a 5-ton bomb load, and a range of 10,000 kilometers. It was officially named Fugaku by January 1944 and designated G10N1 by the Navy. Development officially began at Nakajima's Oda factory, because why not continue throwing resources into an impossibility? The plan to build the G10N1 long-range bomber, affectionately named Fugaku, was a joint effort by the Japanese Army and Navy. Because when you're fighting a war you're slowly losing, the best idea is clearly to pour everything into building a massive 6-engine bomber that could, in theory, save the day. Let's take a look at the specs, because honestly, the only thing missing was a Make Dreams Come True button. Aircraft type. 6-engine ultra long-range strategic bomber. Because going big and actually flying are basically the same thing. Crew. At least 6 brave souls who either didn't get the memo about the odds of survival, or were just really dedicated to Nakajima's over-the-top fantasies. Dimensions. Length 46 meters, about half a football field. Wingspan 63 meters. Height 8.8 meters. You could probably fit a giraffe under those wings. Wing area 330 square meters. Engines. Originally planned Nakajima Ha-54 air-cooled 4-row 36-cylinder radial. Max power 5,000 horsepower. Perfect for when you need to ignore aerodynamic limitations. Final choice. Mitsubishi Ha-50 air-cooled 2-row 22-cylinder radial. Max power of 3,100 horsepower. Imagine going from a dream car to a mid-size sedan. Reality checks suck. Propellers. Diameter between 4.5 and 4.8 meters, featuring 6 to 8 constant speed blades or coaxial counter-rotating 4-blade designs. Weight specs. Empty weight 42 tons, normal takeoff weight 70 tons, maximum takeoff weight 122 tons. Who needs practicality when you have ambition? Performance max speed 780 kilometers per hour at an altitude of 10,000 meters. Ceiling above 15,000 meters. Range, depending on the bomb load, 19,400 kilometers with 5 tons of bombs, 18,000 kilometers with 10 tons, and 16,500 kilometers with 15 tons. Basically, it could fly across half the globe and give the enemy a big surprise, assuming it ever made it off the runway. In April 1944, Japan decided that what they really needed was to dust off those ambitious bomber plans and take another shot at building the largest, most impractical plane ever imagined. Enter the Fugaku Prototype Committee, created to bring Chikuhei Nakajima's fever dream to life. Naturally, Nakajima himself was put in charge, because if you're chasing a doomed idea, you might as well let the man who dreamed it up steer the ship. The committee members were a who's who of Japanese wartime industry. Representatives from the Army's 8 aviation technology research institutes, Navy Tech, Nakajima, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo Metals, and other poor souls roped in for the fun. The first meeting took place in April at Nakajima's Koizumi factory, but according to Army records, they had already started pushing paperwork as early as mid-March. The Ministry of Munitions, not to be outdone in the chaos department, decided to throw an order at Kawanishi Aircraft for an entirely different heavy bomber project, the TB, because apparently the best way to solve one impractical bomber project is to start another one. Of course, building a plane as big as a small village has its challenges. First up was the engine. Nakajima's grand idea was to create a 5,000 horsepower monstrosity by taking an existing 18-cylinder, 2,500 horsepower engine and doubling it. Just stack 'em up. The result? The Ha-54 engine, a 4-row 36-cylinder behemoth that would probably make even Frankenstein cringe. Predictably, cooling all those cylinders was a massive headache. Nakajima's grand solution? Special devices for cooling. Turns out special devices meant nothing more than some forced cooling fans. Genius, right? It's like trying to cool a bonfire with a couple of desk fans. Someone suggested using air cooling for the front rows and liquid cooling for the rear ones. But considering Japan's expertise, or lack thereof, in liquid cooling, that idea went straight to the bin. They eventually ditched the Ha-54 concept and decided to go with 6 Ha-44 engines, basically the original engines, multiplied, because when in doubt, just add more of what already doesn't work. Ultimately, they settled on Mitsubishi's Ha-50, a 22-cylinder air-cooled radial engine. Not quite the powerhouse they hoped for, but at least it wouldn't catch fire every time you tried to start it. Next, there was the issue of how to keep this 120-ton beast from collapsing under its own weight. The solution? A fancy multi-part landing gear design where each tire weighed over a ton. And in a stroke of genius, they decided that to save weight after takeoff, they would just throw away the extra landing gear. That's right. Jettison part of the landing gear after takeoff and figure it out later. After dropping the bombs and lightening the load, they could land with just the main wheels. Then they'd slap on new wheels, load it up again, and do it all over. What could go wrong? With massive engines and enormous wings, Fugaku needed a runway of at least 1,020 meters just to get airborne, meaning it could only take off from a few airfields, which themselves would become prime targets for the enemy. But sure, let's pretend this is feasible. Nakajima also decided that since the crew would be on long missions, they should be comfortable. Hence, he added 6 days' worth of provisions, a pressurized cabin, and self-sealing fuel tanks, made from 2 tons of rubber. All that effort to keep the crew cozy, before inevitably sending them on a suicide mission. There were other brilliant ideas on the checklist too, developing a turbocharger to give the engines 4,500 horsepower at 9,000 meters, figuring out how to make a giant pressurized compartment that wouldn't implode, and coming up with strong lightweight materials that were somehow magical. The engineers at Nakajima's Mitaka Research Institute even began building a huge factory capable of assembling a plane with a 60-meter wingspan. You have to admire their dedication to the dream, even if the dream itself was a logistical nightmare. By July 1944, reality finally slapped Japan across the face. The Imperial Navy suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and Saipan fell to Allied forces. Suddenly, fighter planes to defend the homeland seemed a lot more important than giant bombers that could barely leave the ground. By August, the Fugaku Prototype Committee held a formal dissolution ceremony, and Fugaku was mercifully put to rest, joining the ranks of ambitious projects that never should have left the sketchpad. The records of what happened next to the Fugaku project are a bit hazy. According to Japan's Imperial Headquarters confidential log, the work on Fugaku was halted on April 28, 1944, with the note that it would remain a research subject, which sounds like code for "we're just going to pretend this never happened." Engineer Kazuo Nakamura later recalled, that they continued working until August, laboring over blueprints of Fugaku's massive frame, even as the project officially unraveled around them. By the latter part of World War II, Japan's fate unfolded just as Chikuhei Nakajima had predicted, annihilated by strategic bombing. As for the records of all those glorious Fugaku research projects, well, they were either destroyed by the chaos of war or deliberately burned, leaving behind little more than myths and legends. There were different versions of the plane, one with a single vertical tail and tricycle landing gear, another with twin vertical tails and tail dragger gear, and then a so-called final version with a double-decker nose. Let's not even mention the conspiracy theories about a misunderstood elliptical-winged Kawanishi TB prototype that some folks believed was Fugaku. Fugaku's true form remains a clouded mystery, a fitting end for a project that never quite touched reality. The reality is that the age of massive piston engine bombers like Fugaku vanished with the arrival of the jet era. Take the Convair B-36 Peacemaker, for instance, the American answer to massive bombers. It showed up, puttered around, and then vanished as quickly as it arrived. Nakajima had dreamed of using Fugaku to crush America, but in reality, the B-52s that replaced the B-36 went on to drop 550,000 tons of bombs in Vietnam, yet even that didn't bring victory. If Fugaku had ever taken flight, would it have fared any better? History gives us a pretty clear answer. Probably not. The idea that Nakajima's grand invincible strategy was ever feasible deserves a good laugh, especially when compared to the B-29, a smaller yet equally ambitious project. The B-29's development started in 1934, with the final design completed by the end of 1939. The prototype flew in September 1942, but full-scale production didn't kick off until September 1943. By 1946, they had managed to produce 2,766 units. Each B-29 cost around $600,000, a $3 billion gamble that had only seen a wind tunnel before the production order was placed. It was famously known as the $3 billion bet. By contrast, Fugaku was the kind of dream where people placed bets before they even found the casino. And what about the B-36, which was closer in scale to Fugaku? Its development began in April 1941 under the premise that if Britain fell, the US would still be able to bomb Germany from American soil. The initial prototype work began in November 1941, with Convair slogging through endless challenges. The prototype finally flew on August 8, 1946, just a little too late for the war. The B-36 officially entered service in June 1948, powered by 6 gigantic 3,800 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R-4360 engines that, much like Fugaku's engines, had major overheating issues. The problem was so bad that they eventually slapped on 4 General Electric J47-19 jet engines just to get the B-36 to perform decently. By that point, it was July 1949, and the B-36 only had a decade left in service before it, too, was relegated to the aviation graveyard. The B-36 had a production run of just 384 units, including prototypes and experimental models, a number that's almost laughably small compared to Nakajima's original plan for thousands of Z-series bombers. The reasons for this low production? The war ended, and the maturity of jet engine technology made piston engine aircraft quickly obsolete. It's safe to say that even if Nakajima had managed to build Fugaku, it would have shared the same fate as the B-36, obsolete the moment it took flight. Even with America's enormous industrial might, the B-36's development was a massive headache. So what chance did Fugaku, proposed in late 1942, really stand? It's no wonder that Fugaku's destiny was anything but optimistic. As for how much Nakajima managed to secure in funding for this boondoggle, well, that remains a mystery. In a militaristic state like wartime Japan, the bigger the military plan, the more it sparked the fever dreams of delusional officers. And for the industrialists behind the plans, whether or not they were feasible was irrelevant. The goal was to line their pockets with as much funding as possible. In the end, Fugaku turned out to be nothing more than a fleeting fantasy. Ironically, from the ashes of Nakajima Aircraft arose Fuji Heavy Industries, which eventually became a renowned automobile manufacturer. The name Fuji stands as a fitting elegy to Fugaku, the grand bird that never left its nest, forever a symbol of unfulfilled dreams soaring through an imaginary sky.